Hey, everybody. Welcome to the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. Jonathan Greenblatt is back with us. We shall chat with Jonathan in just a second, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. All right, let's get to Jonathan Greenblatt. Since 2015, he has served as the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, more commonly known as the ADL, and is its sixth national director. He leads all aspects of the world's leading anti-hate organization, whose mission since its founding in 1913 is to fight the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. In 2022, Jonathan released It Could Happen Here, a book that sounds an alarm, warning that hate and systemic violence is gathering momentum in the United States, and that violence on a more catastrophic scale could be just around the corner. Jonathan, welcome back into the back room.
Thank you for having me, Andy. Good to be back.
So before we get into all the insanity in the world these days, I want to talk about something that's positive and exciting, and that was Monday night at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in D.C. The Anti-Defamation League held its In Concert Against Hate event. This included members of Congress, Jewish activists, celebrities showed up to support the ADL on its 30th anniversary concert. So what does this event mean to the ADL and to you personally?
Well, the Concert Against Hate, as you said, is in its 30th year. It's really become a moment where for an organization like ours that focuses on fighting hate every single day, this concert is about finding hope. It gives us the opportunity to bring together people and celebrate individuals who have battled back bigotry and overcome prejudice and really demonstrated hope in the face of hate. And so we celebrate these people. We had some amazing honorees, like this year. We honored Dr. Charles Chavez, who's a scholar of African-American history, who's done really interesting work on racial reconciliation at his perch at George Mason University. We recognized Dr. Manaz Afridi. She's a Pakistani-American woman who teaches at Manhattan College in New York, who's done really good work to teach Muslim people about the Holocaust and to do joint activities with her Jewish and Muslim students. We honored Rosette Goldstein, a Holocaust survivor who's told her story. And of course, Scooter Braun, the award-winning, Grammy-winning, world-famous music producer who brought the Nova exhibit from Israel to the United States to make sure people understood what happened on 10/7. He has been just a hero, and we got to lift up his story as well. Ben Stiller was our host. Mm-hmm. Sia performed. It was an amazing evening. Mm-hmm. And, again, I think everyone at ADL, we do this work day in and day out. We see a lot of ugliness and a lot of darkness. The Concert Against Hate is an opportunity to see the light, and it really was a beautiful thing.
I know this mission that the ADL is on is all-consuming for you. You speak a lot. You're on the cable news shows a lot. There's so much going on in the world. Is it hard, like in an event like this, to sort of like take a step back, breathe, laugh, smile, enjoy, to be able to compartmentalize it for even just an evening?
Yeah, the truth is it's not easy. I want to be clear that we're dealing every day with people who have been harassed, or maybe their home or their property has been vandalized. Many have been assaulted. And we're dealing with all kinds of trauma. And so I feel like our job is really to protect the community, to push back on hate. And that is a very eviscerating, exhausting occupation. And so at a moment like Monday night, it's kind of a chance for people to literally let their guard down and just relax. And that feels very rewarding for us. Mm-hmm. And then you got to get right back to the grind. Mm-hmm. But I think, I know obviously you know this, but as human beings, you got to have some relief. No matter how hard you're running, there comes a point in time where you got to stop and take a drink of water. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what Monday night was all about.
Mm-hmm. What concerns you right now most, both here and abroad?
I think there are a few things that concern me in this moment. So first of all, I deeply worry about division in this country, political division. Whether you voted for President Trump or you voted for Vice President Harris, the truth is his margin in terms of the popular vote was very narrow. And I travel all the time, Andy, and I talk to people all day long. And I don't remember a time when our country was so divided. And so I'm quite concerned to see this simmering resentment on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I recall that when Trump won the first time, this phrase was coined, "not my president."
Right.
And then, of course, when he lost, people felt and were saying that President Biden wasn't their president.
Right.
Like, this is a terrible way to think. And so when I think whether you vote for the red team or you find yourself on the red team or the blue team, we're all on the American team, and we need to pull together. Division hurts all of us. And I don't know yet. I hope that this new Trump administration will really work at bringing people together. Some of the initial announcements, like, the erstwhile Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, I mean, that is not exactly a pick that I would say represents someone who brings people together.
Mm-hmm.
I hope we'll see more of that. I think we need it. I think the country needs it. I think we almost need to heal as a country. Specific to anti-Semitism, I just got back from Europe. The issues there are acute, and they are fairly terrifying. I was in Amsterdam because I saw what had happened, these attacks. I woke up on a Friday morning, Andy. I looked at my phone and saw the video of these assaults on Thursday night. And I called my chief of staff and said, I'm going to Amsterdam. He said, well, when? I said, now. And so I got on the first flight on Saturday after Shabbat, because I observed Shabbat, and met with the community and met with the political leaders there. And then, by the way, I took time while I was there, and I went to Berlin and to Brussels and to Paris. And what the Jewish community is facing in Europe is very alarming. Threats from the far right, threats from the radical left, but also particularly threats from radicalized Muslims in these countries. And when I met with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, I met with the Dutch Prime Minister, he said to me, like, these are radicalized members of the Moroccan and Turkish communities in Amsterdam who perpetrated these attacks. Mm-hmm. And so I'm a very progressive person, a very pragmatic person. I think I'm a pretty middle of the road person. But it's indisputable that we have a real challenge with these three threats. And I worry that also, I wrote a book about this, that it could happen here. That the rhetoric, which has been so violent in the last year, so untoward, could explode into like kinetic violence, go from rhetorical to kinetic violence. And that's very concerning. But I think, Andy, we're a match stroke away from that happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think the match is the economy. If you're a student of history, you understand what happened in one of the greatest democracies ever, in Germany, before Hitler came, and then when Hitler came along, they were struggling. Their economy was dreadful. What happens if we have 15% interest rates and 25% unemployment, and we're really racked with a recession, and he's president with his rhetoric and his scapegoating and his divisiveness? That's what I concern myself with, because we just got to cross our fingers and hope that this economy, for at least the next 2 years, when we can hopefully have another midterm election, which can change the whole landscape, stays strong. Because, to your point, there is just so much animosity, so much resentment, so much anger and hatred against communities of color, anti-Semitism, that if people are really struggling, not just like, oh, eggs are $4 instead of $3.50, but like, I can't feed my kids, right? There's no food because I've been out of work for months. That's what I worry about, because that's what happened back in the day in Europe.
I think that's a very valid concern. I mean, President Obama used to have this phrase. He would say that, like, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think he said it more eloquently than that. And so whereas, this isn't the Weimar Republic, to your point, it's a very, buoyant economy. And despite the things that the president said on the campaign trail, the equity markets have literally never performed better.
Mm-hmm.
In the Dow has hit numbers that would have once seemed unimaginable. We have multiple trillion-dollar companies, for goodness sakes. I could go on and on, but to your point, if things go south, I mean, this is what happens. Populists emerge when systems fail, when people feel like the system isn't delivering on their expectations, whether it's the political parties or the news media or the business establishment, by the way, or the justice system, on and on. And right now, it seems like the common currency in the country is distrust, distrust of institutions, distrust of systems. And so in that type of environment, I think, populists emerge, and typically their tactic is to blame. It's not your fault. It's the elites who did this to you. Mm-hmm. And so when I hear terms like globalist, or when I hear terms like neocons, when I hear terms like cosmopolitans, those are historically terms that have been used as euphemisms for Jews.
Soros backed.
So look, it is certainly true that I might not agree with every policy pursued by every district attorney whose campaign may have been funded or partially funded by George Soros. But that doesn't mean that Soros is the evil hidden hand behind everything that's wrong in the world. But conspiracism, which is now the prevalent current on social media, and distrust seems to be the predominant force in real life. These things combine, Andy, historically in ways that at best are bad for everyone, and at worst are not just bad for Jews, they're apocalyptic for Jews.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of that, we know that Donald Trump has some fascination with Adolf Hitler. Apparently, Mein Kampf sits on his night table, or did back in the day. He wants generals like Hitler had generals. He thinks Hitler did some good things. I'm still trying to rack my brain, trying to figure out just name one good thing Hitler did. Yet, a lot of Jews, or too many Jews, I think, in this country, in this election, became single-issue Jews, still saw him as the great protector of not just Israel, perhaps, but Jews. That I don't understand. Were you surprised by the loyalty to Trump by some Jews in this country because of Israel? At the same time, their willful denial of his infatuation with the most genocidal maniac in history against Jews.
So a few things. So number one, I do think it's fair to say that Donald Trump is a paradox in many ways. So it certainly is true that there were people in his last administration and things that happened during his last tenure that we didn't find problematic in ADL. We found disqualifying. I mean, really, from Steve Bannon to what happened around Charlottesville to, I could go on and on. It's also true that when he was president, there was this rise of xenophobia and some ugly, hateful acts like the George Floyd killing, by the way. At the same time, it's also true that President Trump has a Jewish daughter and a Jewish son-in-law, and there were Jewish grandchildren running around the residence of the White House. I mean, we've never had a president with such an intimate relationship with the Jewish people, never. They cashiered the kitchen at the White House, not for one night, but so the kids could eat there. Mm-hmm. So and it's also true that the Abraham Accords were really important. Mm-hmm. And it's also true that his executive order anti-Semitism was really important and meaningful. So you had this paradox where there were some things that were super problematic, some things that were super important. And there were people around him that were incredibly toxic. And the people closest to him, some of them, were Jewish. And I don't mean secular, unaffiliated. I mean observant, wear it on their sleeve, Jewish people. Mm-hmm. So flash forward to now, I would say that I speak to all kinds of people, Andy, all the time. When we say people become single issue voters, I actually think what I hear a lot more is less it's about Israel and more it's about what happened on 10/7 and then what happened here in the United States. So what I hear from people is less that, I like Trump, or by the way, Kamala, because of where they stand on Israel, and more people being so concerned about what was happening on the campuses, where you were seeing these river to the sea chants, or you were hearing them people say that Zionism is white supremacy, or having, as happened last night here in New York, where the Hillel, there's an effort to try to throw Hillel off campuses across America because these people describe Hillel as part of the, quote, Israeli war machine, which is entirely absurd, for goodness sakes. I mean, God bless Hillel, but they can barely put together like a Havdalah service. Like, if you're relying on them, a bagel brunch is hard on a Sunday. If they're the Israeli war machine, Israel's in a lot of trouble. But I say that jokingly, but I do think I'm the father of 2 college-age kids. And what happened at their campuses last year was insane. And a lot of Jewish people felt like, after 10/7, the anti-Israel protests started that afternoon. And the many university administrations failed to call out what happened, or they did so in a kind of equivocating, ambiguous way. So I think when I've heard people say to me, I used to vote this way, now I'm voting that way, it's less because they're a single issue voter on Israel. It's more because they become singularly concerned about what this new world holds for their kids or their grandkids.
Yeah, I do get that. But it's hard for me as a Jew to be a member of the most persecuted group in history and square how some of my fellow Jews can turn a blind eye to the persecution that's been promised by this administration if it gets elected. And then other things, convicted felon, adjudicated rape. You can make a whole laundry list of things that are just morally, ethically wrong from a religious standpoint, from an ethical, moral standpoint. And I guess that's what just makes it really, really complicated, and nuanced. I'm not a black and white person. My life is about gray. I live in gray every day, and I think gray is where most people live. So I do understand the things you're saying. It just seems like there's such an extreme now. Like Jews voting for someone who has admiration for Adolf Hitler is just something in my 65 years I could never, ever have imagined. It just seems bonkers, no matter what the root cause is for that support.
I get it. I understand that we are living in an upside down world.
Yeah.
Where so much of the things that we've held dear for so long seem to be not just in play, but like in question. So look, I had lunch with one of these people today who say, look, I've always been a member of the Democratic Party, but I'm concerned because I see what Democrats are saying about, or not saying, if you will, about what's happened around these encampments. And they're concerned. We had a situation, you see this all over the country, where we're seeing protests. And Andy, I'm loath to really call them protests, because when we talk about protests, I think many of us have a mental model of like John Lewis and kids at a lunch counter in Greensboro. And yet these people are not like that. These are people vandalizing the homes of university presidents with red triangles and red paint to symbolize blood. These are the people, I could think of a few, from your kind of world, a few personalities from the media who have these activists in front of their house at like 6 a.m, 7 a.m, screaming at them and their children as they pull out of their driveway. And their offense, just so we're clear, these are not spokespeople for the Israeli government. These are just public journalists who happen to be Jewish. And by the way, there are lots of journalists. The only ones who seem to get targeted, Andy, are the Jewish ones. So we had a situation, I was in Los Angeles earlier this week. We now have these activists regularly marching through Jewish neighborhoods. It happened, by the way, here in New York and Brooklyn last week too, marching through predominantly Jewish neighborhoods, like with drums and with megaphones, with like the flags and the whole, wearing covering their identities, intimidating the residents. This is crazy.
It is crazy.
And you had this thing in Amsterdam last week where you had a series of coordinated attacks that took place over almost 7 hours, where Jews across the city were being assaulted with pipes and knives and clubs. Dozens and dozens and dozens of these things. And the assailants they recorded themselves with GoPro cameras and phones. So it's a crazy time. It really is.
Yeah. Well, we recently saw a march in Columbus, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
Members of the newly
Mm-hmm.
formed white supremacist hate group, the Hate Club, very creative,
Mm-hmm. Right.
waving swastika flags, and apparently it's like rooted in some kind of weird turf war between them and a rival white supremacist group called the Blood Tribe.
Yeah.
But when you watch this on the news, and thankfully I think it was like 10 people or 12 people, it wasn't a big group of people, but just the symbolism of it, of people walking through in broad daylight, waving flags with swastikas on it. There's something incredibly disturbing there. I know there's a free speech issue in this country, but there's also a hate crime issue in this country. I know the local authorities there are investigating it. Do you think there's going to be prosecutions to come out of something like that? Or are we just going to see more of this stuff because it's legal, as horrific and offensive as it is?
I think more likely the latter than the former.
Mm-hmm.
I think, 2 weeks earlier, so about 3 weeks ago, Andy, we had a similar white supremacist demonstration in Michigan where they actually rallied in front of an American Legion Hall that was hosting a performance of the Diary of Anne Frank.
Right.
So whether we like it or not, unless you trespass on the property, I will say, let me step back. So at the ADL, we deeply, profoundly don't just believe in civil rights, we live by them. We have fought for them for over 110 years. Like, we are ferocious about the First Amendment. It's also safe to say, because, by the way, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, separation of church and state, like, these are the things that have made this country a safe place and a great place for Jews for hundreds of years. In terms of freedom of expression and freedom of speech specifically, or freedom of assembly, there are or there can be time, place, and manner restrictions about when and how you protest or whatnot. But I must say, Andy, they're very liberal. There's a lot of latitude, like a lot. And so the reality is whether you are marching through a Jewish neighborhood saying, go back to Poland, or you are standing in front of a synagogue, Nazis, those things can be very difficult to shut down if you're not specifically making a threat against a person or a group of people.
Mm-hmm.
So river to the sea is not a problem, or Hitler was right is not a problem. It's when you say, therefore, we're going to kill you, that's the law considers a problem. But I am afraid, to answer your question, we have now moved to a place where anti-Semitism has been normalized, and where these kinds of manifestations, and you mentioned Hate Club and Blood Tribe. Blood Tribe is a much bigger problem. Blood Tribe is a very active neo-Nazi group that's been growing in recent years. And by the way, if President Trump, pardons the people who perpetrated the January 6th event, groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, who very much receded into the background, if their leadership, is walking on the streets tomorrow or whatever on January the 21st, that could also be a dynamic we have to contend with. So all of this is worrisome.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, again, if you look back on Hitler's rise and the groups like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers that he used, when the Nazi Party was founded, it is not a stretch. Like, if I said to you a year from now, when those dudes are all paroled, if they're paroled, how unrealistic would it be for Donald Trump, wink, wink, on the side, have them as his little force, his stormtroopers, brown shirts, or whatever, to go do stuff under the table? Because this is how it's done. History has taught us this is how it's done. And would we put any of this past him? I wouldn't. Would you?
Look, I'm not going to answer specifically to that, but I would just say that there's no question in my mind that America, for a long time, has had a problem with armed militia groups. I mean, the Second Amendment envisions the ability of Americans to form a, quote, well-regulated militia. I don't think one could say that the groups that I've already mentioned here today, like the Blood Tribe or, Proud Boys or Oath Keepers, qualify for that by any measure. And so I have great concern about what would it mean if their leadership felt emboldened? What would it mean if people who have extremist ideas about Jews or the minorities feel like they have the wind at their back?
Hmm.
I mean, that could be very problematic in lots of ways for our community and for other communities too.
What do you think of the nomination of Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel?
You know, to be very honest, like I focus every day on fighting anti-Semitism here at home. So whether it was Jack Lew, the current guy, or Mike Huckabee, or Tom Nides, his predecessor, or David Friedman, like again, we do deal a little bit with Israel. We have an office there in Jerusalem. On a day-to-day basis, I'll comment on things like that. It's just not my day-to-day.
Hmm. You mentioned the college protests before. There's obviously been at least that which is covered on the news. It seems like there's a precipitous drop in that kind of fervor that we saw. What do you think there's a drop? Is it just like there was a bandwagon and kids get caught up in a moment and they maybe mean well, but they're ignorant of certain things? And because it seems to me like that should be heightened because the facts on the ground, the things that upset them didn't go away. But is it symbolic of just young people, how they may get engaged on something today and then move on to the next thing?
Well, I think there are a few things. So it's a good question. So we have definitely seen, at ADL, we track all this information and we're tracking these activities on campus. We actually have a campus crisis newsletter that we now publish almost every day. It's one of these email newsletters. You can sign up at adl.org. Now, what I'll tell you is that while the volume has decreased, Andy, the ones that remain tend to be a little bit more intense. Now, I think the reason why they've decreased is first what you said, which is what happened in the spring was a bit of sort of bandwagoning. It became almost fashionable. And people who didn't even understand what river, what sea, what the conflict was, felt like this is what other people are doing. I want to be a part of a movement. Now, I think turns out that movement has not been very sustainable because turns out Hamas and Hezbollah are pretty horrible organizations with a horrible agenda. Then it also turns out that the school started finally responding to this and suspending groups and actually suspending students. And then for those who thought this was fashionable, this became much less appealing to them when they realized there might be consequences for their actions.
Right.
So number one, there was that bandwagoning. Number two, the universities have simply cracked down and said you can protest, but for example, you can't disturb a class or you can't take over a building. And if you do these things, there will be consequences. Well, that has deterred some of these young people. I think number three, when school ended last year and Vice President Harris was nominated to be the nominee, I think that also took the wind out of their sails a little bit. Now, as we look ahead, one of the things that I think could happen is that the Trump president, look, most young people, all the polls show us that most young people are progressive or have a progressive political orientation. Just as true, including the college kids, even more so than the general population. So I think what could happen is do you remember at 16 or 17, these groups came together, they called themselves the Resistance, right? So I think you could see another kind of spasm of resistance that takes root on college campuses. And if that happens, I do fear that once again, the Jewish kids will be targeted because people will say, Trump is the same as Bibi Netanyahu. Trump is enabling Bibi Netanyahu. Therefore, if you want to post Trump, you need to post Bibi. Bibi is the president of the Jewish state. It's again the Jews, and I think that could happen. And especially to your earlier question, to the extent that things become even more tense, Andy, and again extremists feel emboldened, then you've got to imagine that college campuses will become explosive once again.
Yeah.
And so none of this, to be really honest, I don't want to depress you or your audience, but none of this augurs well. And I think never has been more important. That's why I'm glad I'm on the show. Never has been more important for leaders to lead. President of the United States, president of the university, president of the local PTA. People in positions of authority need to use that authority to kind of evoke our better angels. And I think that it's just never, it's always been important. It's going to be essential for us to make it through these next few years.
Yeah, well, definitely challenging times ahead. We appreciate what you do. Keep up the good fight. Always a great chat, and look forward to having you back to fill us in on all the latest
I would
sanity out
love,
there.
look, man, I would love to come back, Andy. I always appreciate you having me. I love listening, and let's continue the conversation.
All righty, take care. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Matty Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.